In this video, we are gonna set up our project. We'll first have to install a blank new React application. This is gonna be with a template of TypeScript. Let's copy this, paste it in our terminal. Let's call this Formik app. I will leave this link in the description. See you when that's installed. Okay, so now it's installed, let's head over to our application. cd means go to the folder. We'll be using Material UI as our UI library. It is really well done. I really like it. I use it for my personal projects. We'll be looking at these components in more detail later. We'll be using Formik for having the forms, of course, and that's what the course about. And then we'll be using Yup for validation. It is that simple JavaScript library. It's a schema builder for parsing and validation forms, and they work really well with Formik together. So I really encourage you to use them in the future. Okay, so let's start. Let's open our VS Code. That's gonna be Formik app. So we'll start completely from scratch. So let's delete the src folder and just configure our project, install all the dependencies and etc. Let's create an index.txt TypeScript file. Just delete this. We're not gonna use that. Let's go here like this. Okay, so let's go to package.json and delete some stuff. These 3 packages about testing, we don't need them. This one either. The types packages, we'll just move them to dev dependencies. They mean development dependencies. They're not gonna be bundled in our final project when deploying it. Okay, so let's actually install some dependencies that we will be using throughout the project. Let's start with Formik, then Yup. Now we have to install some Material UI libraries. Make sure you spell this right because it's really easy to misspell it. Okay, Material UI core and Material-UI pickers. Formik. Did I misspell something? Oh, I forgot to add. Yep. Let it install. For now, that's enough. We'll install something more later. Let's just make a structure of our folders and make some start. Let's define pages. Let's define components, then utils, and styles. We'll be styling our application with styled components and Material UI in combination, which work really well. Let's make our app. Let's call it app ts6. Index this is. I will be using my own structure. That's gonna be a folders import structure. First I have the plugins import, then I have components import, and then I have extra imports. Okay, so for this we'll need React. Import React from React and just define the function. Hello world. Okay, amazing. And let's put some dashes here. Yeah. Now we can import this up and I guess actually preview our application. Forgot to export it. Export default. Yeah. That's good, and we don't have the styles. We'll style it later. So I guess that's enough. Let's actually try to launch the application. Yarn start and preview how it looks. it must be blank because we deleted everything. Let's open localhost. It's already here. Hello world. Yeah, fine. Let's actually start defining and making some actually coding. So let's first define our global styles. Let's make some like usual styles in index CSS. I'll just import them, and know that you have all the files in the GitHub. You can just copy this. This is just basic HTML CSS that we'll be using. Now let's define our global.styles.css, no, .ts. Sorry, that will be our material UI global styles. Okay, to do that we'll have to first, let's do the plugins import. Then we have to import theme from theme. We haven't created that yet. We'll be creating this now. Import make styles from material UI core styles. Yep. Okay, export. That is gonna be a hook that we will be using throughout our components. It's gonna be use style, make styles, and just create an object. Yeah, return an object. Let's create this theme file. Let's call it theme.ts. Let's call it theme.styles.ts. Yep. Let's also call it styles here. Yeah. And this is just going to create our palette, colors palette. So let's create import from material UI core styles and import a certain color from material UI core .colors. That's going to be cyan. It's a bluish color. You'll see it later. And here we input create movie style and responsive font sizes. They're gonna give us some responsive font sizes. Let's define the theme. Create movie theme. It's the palette. Type dark. Our application will be dark. Primary cyan and secondary cyan too. This is just defining our colors. And now let's just export. Let's just export here. Export const theme. So okay, now we have the theme, and we actually can define our styles. So I will import it because I don't want to type it so much, and explain you how this works. We have the root. That's basically the root of our application. We have the width, auto, margin left, like basic CSS. We have this theme, the breakpoints to up to 600. So this is basically like media queries on the web development, but in material UI. This basically allows us to make changes whenever our application changes size. Now let's define the paper. Like root is the wrapper of all our application. Paper is more concise. Is more about the paper component. I'll show it to you later. And that's enough for now. Let's actually import it. We'll need it here. Let's go to index. Let's close all these files. Go to index and import theme provider. That is a theme provider from material UI core. Import theme from styles theme. Yep. Oh wait, we actually, to do that, that's called absolute imports. We have to change something in the TS config. We have to decide base URL. That's basically the URL where our import starts. Now it should work. That's styles. Yep. Okay, cool. That's actually really handy when you have a very big structure, tree structure of folders. That actually comes very handy to access the first files in the system. Okay, theme provider, and we define the theme. Okay, so in our form we will have a multi-step form. So to do that, we'll first have to, let's make a title with a typography. It's basically like a text, but from Material UI. It's a checkout form, and then we'll have the stepper. What the stepper does is basically make a steps, like different steps. I'll show it to you now. It's gonna be really cool. Stepper needs to access an array of, let's make the array ourselves. Steps. I'll just copy it. And now let's map the steps that map. That's a step. And to do that, we'll have to also, let's import the stepper and import the stepper and the actual step. And let's just return the step. The step takes in, no, that's not the step, that's step label. Step and step label. It takes children, a step label, takes the label. Yep, and we need to give us a key. Build the label. That's basically it to see the stepper, I guess. Let's take a look. Something is wrong in the index. It shouldn't be. We'll have to restart it because we changed our TS config. Yeah, the following changes were made, so now it should work. And we will actually see our stepper. Yeah, here it is. Really cool. And let's also define our theme. So our theme is completely dark. To do that, we'll have to define, let's make a wrapper for application, which will simply change all the styles of our application. So let's go to components. Let's create organisms. I'll be following atomic design pattern, and atoms, and then layout. Layout. So in here, let's define the layout, which will be a wrapper. It will wrap each of our pages. So let's just delete all of this, delete this, and delete this. And that will be our wrapper. And here we are going to simply import CSS baseline from Material UI. CSS baseline, yeah. Then a div and paper. The paper that we defined before in the theme. And it will take all the characteristics that it should have. Find the props. The props will only have the children, so let's just put it here. FC. For some reason my auto import doesn't work. Oh, that's gonna be a React node. Yeah. My FC didn't import my CSS baseline. CSS baseline, if I'm not wrong. Yes, that's right. Paper. And that's good. That's all we need for now. We'll also put like stuff like header and footer here, but that's gonna be later. Let's define our index.ts that will help us do the imports. Let's put export default as wrapper. In this course, I will be using the best approaches you can use to structure your project, so you can take ideas from it, and that's one of them. Define all your imports from the file in the index. Components, layout. Yeah, that's it. That's all we need. You see how it shortens the imports? If not, we would have to use the wrapper here, and that's just too much. It's useless. Now we put the wrapper up here, and the children just go inside here, and now, yeah, you see, our layout changes completely, and we have the dark background, and this can be changed in the theme that we defined right here. Yeah, the dark. If we put light here, it is meant to change. Yeah, everything changed. That's how easy to change the theme in Material UI. And now we have it all set it up. Now we can actually work on the forming stuff. Let's actually start doing the form itself. Let's head over to the app component, and let's take a look at what we have. We have 3 steps, the first one, the second one, and the third. And each step will have its own form. They are different from each other. So to do that, we'll have to set up a local state with useState hook. We'll call it active step and set active step. Use state and put a 0. So we'll start from the first index, and we'll have to define something that will be basically changing. The content will be changing dependent on this index. So let's define a function that will render specific content dependent on this index. So let's call it something like render step content. It will take a step, which is a number, and return, no, let's do a switch state, switch step. In the case of the index being 0, we'll return, what will we return? Let's see what we'll have to return. We'll have to return the shipping address. Let's just copy this and just paste it here. That's just the temporal. We'll actually be doing forms here later. But that's just to see how it looks to start with. Case 1. Yeah, that's not like that. That's like that. Yep. And we have to return the next one is the payment details. Yep. And the last one is gonna be the reviewer order. Okay, cool. Now we have to put it somewhere. Well, we can put it right here, and just call it with the active index inside, active step. But these have to be inside the form, so we can now actually create the Formik form. Import Formik from Formik. Wrap this with Formik. And wrap this with also with the form. Form would also be imported from Formik. Yep. Okay, cool. Formik requires certain fields to be defined, which are the initial values. These are basically the fields that will be used in the input, and the onSubmit function. This is just a callback when the form is being submitted. Okay, so initial values, we don't have anything yet, but let's actually define them. Let's create this a utils folder, or we have it, and let's just call it initial values .ts, and I'll just paste it here. Let's actually make another folder which will be all the fields that we will require. Let's call it form model, with all the fields that we will be using. I'll just import them here, and you can import them from GitHub. That's basically all the fields we'll be using. And we have the form ID, which is a checkout form, and each field that we will be using, like a first name, last name, and this will be the name, the label that will, this will be like a placeholder. That's the name of the field itself, and that's the required error message. Whenever we don't specify the required message, it is not required. Okay, so that's the message that will be displayed in the case of the field getting an error. Okay, now let's set up the initial values. and we'll do it this way. We import this model, we just call it model, and we have the const form field, and all these fields, let's just destructure our object from the model. Yep, we have it all. And now let's just export default in the format that is appropriate for our for the Formik, because look, this is defined in this format. For example, first name, and we just set an empty string. So in order to do that from these values in an appropriate structure, we'll be doing it like that. We cannot just do that, first name, and this will not be inferred, and that's the problem. So the solution is doing this, and now all of this is inferred directly here, so that just prevents us from any typos. That can also have any values like a boolean, a string. So now let's actually import it here. Let's import it in this component. Now let's actually import all these initial values into our component and hook it up with Formik. So const selected, we'll just put it all. So we'll import initial values, just directly import, or either we'll define the index also here in the utils index.ts. Well, either not. And now let's just hook it up with our Formik form, so it receives all the fields that are gonna be in our form. So let's import it from utils, initial values, and now we have the initial values. That's a default export. Initial values. Yep. Let's put it right here. Okay, cool. So now we can actually create our form and put some text fields and see how it looks. And then we'll be doing the validation, but let's first make our components. So let's start by defining these ones. This is basically the different contents that we will receive. So okay, so now we can actually do this content. Let's make a forms folder. Let's call it shipping address form.tsx, and let's just do it right here. I'll just copy this structure, just delete all of this, and put address form. Yep. The props that we'll receive, let's just put props type, and let's define an interface props type. Yep, we don't need that, okay. Let's actually start creating it. Let's see how we need that to look like. Let's import it here. Let's create an index in the form so we can import it easily. Export default as from components, organisms, and then the forms. Okay. And that is meant to be, yeah, address form. We actually don't need to define all of that. We just do that. That should work. Yeah. Okay, so let's import it here. That's going to be address form from components.organisms.forms. Yep. And let's just replace it with this and see if we can see this address form. Address form. Yep, here we have the address form. Amazing. So now let's actually start creating our fields. We'll be using we'll be using atomic. And now let's actually start creating our own fields. I'll show you now. We'll be using material. Stop. And now let's actually start using our own fields. Let's head over to Material UI and see. We'll be using our, first of all, a text field. Let's search it in the components. It must be somewhere, yeah, text field. And we will be using this one, the standard one. And this is the validation that we'll be using. That's basically an error prop with helper text up here. So let's try to implement it. Let's create our own components, because there in the form fields we'll be defining some special configuration for using error validation with Formik and Yup. You'll see it now. Maybe it sounds complicated, but it's quite simple. So input field. Let me just copy this here. Address form. Input field. Okay, cool. So here we'll have to start importing some stuff from Material UI. And first of all, and the whole component we'll have is a text field from Material UI core. Additionally to that, in order to handle the errors from Formik, we'll be using a hook. It is called use field from Formik. It has to take the name that is defined in the initial values. So basically one of those, first name.name. That's what it has to receive in order to work. So let's define this in the props. First of all, it requires error text, which is basically the text that will be displayed. So for that, yeah. And the props. The props are correspondent to the default text field props. To import that from Material UI. And now use it here. Props.props. Let's call it default props rather, so it's more clear. Props.default props dot name. Here we have the name. So amazing. Let's also change a test config to strict false, so it doesn't shout at us so much. Now this should resolve. Yep, hopefully. And now we have the field here and meta. This is important, the order, don't mix it up. And now let's just separate some stuff from the imports, from the props, error text, we just put props, and rest props. What this syntax actually does is it takes out from the props the error text, and this one is the props without error text. That's actually a really handy feature of JavaScript, so taking it into account. And now we have to define how our text field looks. So let's put a type, which is the text. Let's put helper text. Let's call it for now like a helper text. And let's just structure our fields, which will be the field from use field and rest props dot default props. Well, let me see what, yeah, rest props default props. Okay, amazing. And now let's create a function which will be rendering our helper text, and that's important because it will check if our field was ever touched and it had an error field. So let's define this here. Touched error from, we have to use Lodash here. If you haven't heard of it, it's a really cool JavaScript library. I really encourage you to look it up, see how it works. It has a lot of different useful functions, so I really encourage you to try it out. Okay, so it is already built in the React application, so we don't have to install it. Okay, let's use the add. Take out the meta, the touched, and the error. What add function from Lodash actually does, it creates an array of values corresponding to the path of the object in this case being the meta, and we're extracting touched and error fields. So now we can easily use it. So in this case, we have to verify if both of this field, touched and the error, are being true, and then we return the error. And this function, let's use it inside this helper text and just call it inside here. And that's basically it for input field. Now we can actually try and use it in our form. So inside our address form, now we can actually use this input field. Yep. First, let's define an index file here. You already know the syntax, so input field from input field, yeah. Okay, we got that. So we can import it from here. So now that we have this input field, let's actually try and see how it looks. So to do that, we have to make this required. So this will take default props, and we have to pass the name. Now let's take something here. It will be form field, and that will be Formik values from Formik. That's just a type. And from these form fields, let's just destructure. All our fields we'll be using in this component, so are those. Let's just put here. So the name for this one will be first name dot name. And that's basically it. We just have to put the label, which will be first name dot label, and a full width true. Where this is actually going? This is going into here, into default props, which are text field props, and this default props is being destructured inside our text field from material UI. So this is basically receiving all this information, and now we'll see how it works all together. These address forms have to receive the form field, so let's just put it here, form field. We have to import the form field from destructured from the form model. Yep, and that should be it. Let's look at the form model so you remember. It's basically all these values. This is the form model. Okay, let's take a look if it works. Let's open. So let's take a look if it works. Yep, we have the first name field ready. So once we define all the components, it will be really fast. I can imagine it feels like a lot, but when you define all the fields, it is all structured. It's actually really easy to build the application. So no worries, I will be guiding you for each step, and we'll be implementing UP validation later. So see you in the next video. Now let's actually try and make our form look pretty. Let's head over to the address form and let's create a grid, which I talked about before. Let's take a look at it again, how the grid would work inside with Material UI. It's basically a new thing in web development. Before it was only Flexbox, but now the grid allows us to make a way more flexible grids. So let's try it in our application. So let's first define the the title of our form typography is basically like a text. This is the shipping address. Okay, cool. We don't need these divs. So let's start creating our grid. Grid is important from the core, material UI core. We will have, it will be a container, and we'll have a spacing of, for example, 3. Then we have another grid, which will be like an item that basically indicates that's the main, that's the wrapper, that's the container of the grid. That's an item of a grid. That's very important to define, otherwise it may work in the wrong way. So let's define XS of 12 and SM of 6. Okay, let's see how it looks, and now we'll look at the documentation so you get a better idea. So what is that? So do you see it starts to take more shape? Let's see what XS. What this basically indicates is the way that it is being displayed on the screen, kinda like a percentages, like fragments that will be in this line. So let's try to do more, and you'll understand and take practice and see how it works. So grid, that's an item of the overall grid. XS12 and SM6. We'll have the input field too. We'll change it now. That's a last name. And that's 2, and that's a last name. That's also full width. Let's create another grid. And etc. So I'll just import all of the grids because it's basically boilerplate, it's the same things. Oh, now we have all the fields set up. Let's change this props to default props. Okay, so now that you get an idea, I'll import the rest of the grids for this file, change some small stuff. We don't have select fields yet. Okay, so you get an idea. Let's just add a few more props, so we call it the default props. And now let's make some more fields, more types of fields, because we are not only having input fields, we're also having select fields. So let's start with those. And let's look how we will implement it. Let's look how actually select field looks in the material UI. So let's just find select. And that's how select works. You basically are able to select those. So let's try to also have error handling here, which we will be using. So let's try select field, input field. Let's just copy this, delete all of that, delete that, delete that, all this information, and now try to use it. So we'll have a form control. Then we will have an input label, which will take a label. We'll set it up all in the props right now. Then we have a select. We have a menu item. That's wrong, menu item. Right. And here we have item label. Input label will be from here. Label will be from props. Label, data, and the rest from props. Yep. Let's have to define it here in the props type. Yes, like that. And now, in the same manner as with the input field, we just define this stuff, which this is use field from Formik. Then we have add from Lodash, import add from Lodash, and form helper text will be also imported from material UI. Form. Let's just copy it. Yep. Like that. Okay. The item will be mapped because the select has multiple fields. So we have data here, which is here. Let's just map this data. We have an item and we have an index, and that's important. We have a menu item and a label, and we'll be using the key, the index as a key for this element, and the value of item.value. Okay, cool. We have the select done. Let's go head over to the grid that we were doing and add some more stuff. I'll just import it directly. And we're gonna be missing checkbox field, and let's actually try to do it. And we're missing some imports here, so let's define them. What are the cities? Cities are gonna be imported from okay, so here we have some of the fields which are undefined, and these are just gonna be static stuff, so like the countries and the cities. And let's just put them down here. You can copy them later from GitHub. You have all the links to these files directly. Let's change the props. Let's change these props. Only one prop, yeah. Okay, let's import the select field. We'll import it from here. Let's actually put it here. Let's just change this to this. Let's copy this. Select field. Make this select field. It should work. Call it select fields. It's not plural, it's singular. And that is gonna be called select field. Here, right? And we don't need this, we're not using that. Wait. Okay, and additionally to that, we have to finish this up by doing render helper text. Just call it inside here. And additionally to that, to the select, we have to pass the value. The value, which will be, if it is selected value, then it is the selected value, and else it is just a string. And we just pass all the field from there. That's basically all the props of the select, of the default select. And now we're missing checkbox field, and let's actually create it fast. I'll checkbox field.tsx, and let's just put it inside here, and you can copy it from GitHub. This is just boilerplate. It is basically the same. We're using use field, that is form control label, a checkbox. I'll show it to you how it looks in the material UI. It is basically like that. This is a type of checkboxes. This is a very handy. Okay, so now that we have our checkbox, let's put it inside our index. Let's just change this. That's gonna be a checkbox, and change the name, and then just import it here. And it should actually work, and we can actually preview it. Yeah, so we have our full form ready to work with all the information. And we can actually preview it now. Stop cut previous. Okay, but now we're missing a checkbox field. Okay, everything done, but we're missing a checkbox field. Let's actually create this checkbox field. This is also gonna be a component from Material UI. Let's just create it fast. It basically the same structure as before with the other fields. Let's import all the needed imports. Define the interface props. Then create our component. Then make a return statement. In the return, we return the form control. And then we return a form control label and the render helper text, which is a function, as before, which we have to create right now. So first, we just structure our props. We get the label, we get the rest props. We get the field meta helper from use field props. And we get the set value from the helper. What that actually does, you can set the value of the field in the Formik form up here. If we take a look where we have the Formik and initial values, we can set that field through this function which we took from the helper. And now let's create our helper function text. And inside here, as before, we use the load dash function, and then if touched and error, we return the form helper text error, which is then used back here. And we have to define a function on change. This is basically happens whenever the checkbox is being changed. This function is being fired, so we get the event and set value. This function, we fire it, set value with the event, with the target. We don't get autocomplete, but it's event, target, and checked. That's a boolean, if it is checked or is it not. Okay, so that's fine. We created our function. Let's export it, export default, and let's import it in our index. So export default as checkbox field from checkbox field. Right, and now we can import it here, right here, and we have it ready working. Well done, guys, you've done a great job. In the next lesson we're gonna integrate Yoop to have validation for all these fields. Hey guys, so in this video we're going to integrate validation to our form. Let's start defining on how does validation work with Formik and Yoop. So starting here, we have to first, to integrate Yoop into Formik, we have to add the field validationSchema. And we have to provide a validation schema for that. So let's directly create a file in utils, which we will call validationSchema.ts, and start defining how our validation schema will work. So let's directly export it, export default, it will be an array, and we'll have to start defining each of our fields. So let's import our fields from checkout form model. So that will be our form model, and we have all these fields, and we have to add moment, which we didn't install yet, and we will install right now. And we'll have to add Yoop, which we already have installed. Okay, now we can actually preview it. The form should be ready, up and working. Whoa, that's actually amazing how in such a fast time we were able to build all that. That's amazing. So, but that's something wrong went with this field. Let's investigate and try to fix it. That was select field. Ah yeah, we forgot to destructure the rest of the props. You see, it is unused. Now we destructure it, and also the error field, which we must pass inside here, and that is a isError boolean. Let's see if that fixed it. Yeah, perfect. That's now fixed and up and working. There is actually a bug with this module that we installed, and it just throws us an error. So in order to solve it, we have to head over here and actually change the version of our module. It will be datefns. We'll change it from our version to this one. In order to do that, just head over to the terminal, kill the app, and just put yarn. That will install the package of the version we just specified in the package JSON. Once this is done, this application must start working, and it's actually getting shape. So yeah, it's installed, so let's try to launch it. So once our package been installed, let's actually try and do this form. Let's see what it gives us. We put the name on the card. If I go away, doesn't work. Amazing. So let's put my name. Let's try the date actually. Does it work? Yeah, it does. We can select the year. So for example, the next year, the month, and amazing. We got the expiry date. Amazing. So a card number, for example, if I say some random number, it doesn't work. It has a regular expression that validates it. So let's put the default. So it lets us pass. Yep. CVV, let's try put some random number. And it also doesn't work because it has its own regular expression behind it. So let's try and put next. Amazing, that actually works, and we can actually place our order, and we have already defined a function for that. Let's remember that in the app component, whenever it is the last item, the last index, we send a submit form. So this must work. It must sleep for a second. So let's try. Let's actually change these places. Yep. Place your order. It is sleeping for 1 second, and we're getting the alert with all the data. So to fix this footer, we just have to specify some more styling to the typography. So the variant will be body2. The color will be secondary, basically gray, so text secondary, and the alignment will be in the center, so align center. Let's take a look. Yeah, that's so cool. Okay, thank you everyone who were attending this course. I really appreciate it. Hit that like button and subscription. Thank you so much, and happy coding.